Caleb Thornton is from the Secretary of State's office. His job title is Legal Policy and Rulemaking Manager. In his role, his primary responsibilities include leading elections division rulemaking activities, working with stakeholders and department executive team members on proposed and active legislation, advising county clerk offices on their legal obligations under Colorado law and rule when they administer elections, overseeing a team of attorneys who review complaints from the public, who draft forms for use in elections, and who review and approve county plans for holding their elections. And finally, he works with attorneys in the Colorado Attorney General's office as they represent the state Secretary of State's office in litigation. Caleb is a native of Arvada and currently lives in Adams County along with his wife and 2 sons. So I am now going to turn it over to Caleb to give us our presentation. Thanks, Caleb.
Thanks so much. Thank you for that introduction. Let me see if I can share my screen here. Can everybody see my screen? Great. Well, thank you. Before I start, I just want to say thanks so much for having me today. This is a topic that I find to be very interesting. So I'm glad that so many people decided it was interesting enough to spend some of their time on a Saturday here talking about it. So we'll go through today. The goal here is to talk really about how recall elections in the state of Colorado work. I'm going to give us some background on where recall comes from and where it's going and what we're seeing in kind of the modern day when it comes to recall elections. As we said, please feel free to interrupt me anytime with a question. Be happy to take those as we're going through this so that we don't have to come back to it later on. All right, let's start. Okay, so recall in the United States. So recall is actually a relatively, oh, I'm sorry, did somebody have a question? Okay. Recall is generally it's actually a relatively new concept in the US. It was first adopted in LA, the city of Los Angeles in 1903. And then Michigan and Oregon were the first states to adopt it in 1908. Overall, 19 states and the District of Columbia now allow citizens to recall state officials. And it's interesting, if you actually look at the breakdown of states that allow for recall of their state elected officials, it's actually very regional. Most of the Intermountain West and the Pacific Coast states allow for it. You don't actually see much of this over on the East Coast, the Upper Midwest, or the Southeast. It's just for whatever reason, it was kind of a trend in the early 1900s to allow for this in the newer states that had been formed out west. So that's kind of where you'll see it today. So outside of Colorado, we have some very recent examples of state level recalls that were initiated. So in Wisconsin, you had Scott Walker, the governor there. There was a recall election for him in 2012. In that case, he did keep his job, so the recall did fail. California's had 2 examples in the last 20 years. Gavin Newsom being the most recent this year in 2012 when he kept his position. Gray Davis, on the other hand, in 2003 did not. He lost his recall election and had to leave office. In Colorado, our most recent examples at the state level are probably the most prominent ones are the recall of 2 state senators in 2013, which were successful. And those recall efforts ultimately flipped the chamber, at least for a year. And then attempts to recall the governor here in the state over the last couple of years have been unsuccessful, and those petitions just weren't returned at all or not with enough signatures. So that's kind of a history on recall. So let's talk briefly about the general idea of the right to recall in Colorado. It actually was not part of the state's original constitution, so it wasn't in there in that original draft. It was initiated, however, in 1912. So you can see it was very much a movement in the Western states in the early 1900s. Colorado was no exception, and it was adopted in 1912. You can see on the screen here, the right to recall can be found in Article 21, Section 1 of our state constitution. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the gist of it is that every elected public officer of the state can be recalled from office. And that's a right. If you look at kind of the case law on this, when courts have weighed in on the right of recall, they put the right of recall up there with the right to initiate and the right for referendum. So it's kind of it's an important right for the citizens of the state that they have, that they are free to use, really, with some limited constraints, but they're free to use on their elected officers. You'll note that in Section 4 of that article, it actually extends this right to recall to the registered electors of a county, city and county, a city and town of the state. So that it really pushed the right to recall folks all the way down to that more local level. Now we see recalls obviously beyond even these. So we see school board recalls, we see special district recalls. I mean, you can really recall pretty much any elected officer in the state of Colorado. Your constitutional right to recall is somewhat limited to these, but the legislature has created the right in statute to recall other elected officers as well. So that's why you can see it really at any level of government here in the state of Colorado. Okay, so let's talk basics of recall here in the state. So before I get to that, let me note what I'm not going to talk about, because as I mentioned, you can recall pretty much anybody in the state of Colorado. However, the way that you do that can differ depending on the office that you're looking at. So what we're not going to be talking about today is the recall of municipal officers. So city council members, mayors. That can really differ depending on whether the city is a home rule city and the size of the city. So the rules for municipalities kind of vary around the state, and they are certainly different than what we see for state level recalls. We're also not going to talk special districts today. Like I said, you absolutely have the right to recall even special district officers, but that process is very different than what we see at the state level. So we're not going to be talking about that. What I am going to be talking about is the recall of officers such as statewide officers. So governor, secretary of state, treasurer, members of the General Assembly, although they're not statewide, it's the same process. And then also members at the county level. So your county commissioners, your county clerk, your county sheriff, and then also school board members. They follow the same process as all those that I just mentioned. One other thing to note, we're not going to be talking about the recall of federal officers. So House of Representatives, Senator. That is because the US Constitution does not allow for states to recall federal officers. So we get this question a lot. Hey, I want to recall my congressman. Well, the answer is you can't. The Constitution, the federal Constitution, and we've had federal courts weigh in on this, says that once they're elected, they get to serve out their term unless they are expelled, for example, or something like that from Congress. So no right to recall a federal officer at all in the state. Okay, so with that in mind, let's talk some general limitations on recalling people in the state. There's some timing things here. So when it comes to recalling somebody, you can't recall them within 6 months after or before an election. It's a buffer zone, basically. So they get 6 months to prove to you that they should keep the job. And then if you're 6 months out from the election, the legislature says, hey, we're close enough to an election for that person that we're not going to have you recall them. If you don't want them there, just don't vote for them in the upcoming election. There is one exception to this rule, and it's kind of interesting because it's actually in the Constitution. Members of the General Assembly can be recalled anytime after they have served 5 days in the legislature. So they get elected, they're there for 5 days. Once that 5th day has passed, they are subject to be recalled. Now you can start the process of recalling them. Now, as we'll talk about it takes a while. So it would be unlikely that you would recall them in their first session, but you could start the process. The other limitation, big limitation in state recall, is that it's really hard to recall somebody after you try once and fail. You have to go gather a ton of signatures. You already have to gather a bunch, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But if you're trying a second time, you're having to gather 50% of the votes cast, signatures from 50% of the votes cast. So that's a huge, heavy lift, and it's a pretty significant limitation on trying to recall somebody. All right, so signatures needed. This is a big question we get all the time from folks who want to start this process or who are just interested. Generally speaking, if you want to recall somebody, you need to go out and collect signatures accounting to 25% of the votes cast for that office in the last election. So on the screen here, you can see here's some general numbers. If you wanted to recall Governor Jared Polis today, you need to gather 631,266 signatures. By comparison, if you wanted to initiate a measure, which happens all the time at the state level, you would need to gather 124,632 signatures. So you can see there, the signature threshold is significant. I will tell you that at the state level, we have never had even an initiative turn in more than 250,000 signatures. It's hard to do. It's hard to get that many signatures. It's a little bit different for school district directors. You need to get 40% of the votes cast for school district director positions. So it's a little bit higher threshold for them. And then the timing to gather those signatures is you've got 60 days to gather all the signatures you need from the time the petition is approved. And by comparison, for initiatives, you have up to 6 months to gather the signatures that you need. Now, sometimes they do it in shorter, but generally speaking, you've got a significantly longer time frame to get the signatures you need for initiatives than you do for a recall. So, you know, I note this because, you know, we saw the recall in California this year, right? And it did fail, but they got it to an election. The truth is that the recall process in California is a lot easier to get to an election than it is here. The threshold for signature gathering there is significantly lower, and they have a lot more time. In Colorado, it's a very high signature threshold, and it's a very low amount of time. And by the way, that signature threshold, that's a constitutional thing. So that's not even something the legislature put in there. That is actually in the Constitution. So how would an election be run? Generally speaking, if you get to a recall election, it's going to be run by mail ballot. You're going to have VSPCs. It's basically it's run the same way as the last coordinated election. So it's going to be run exactly the same. If it's run with another election, which can happen, it's going to be on the same ballot. And then the way that it's formatted in Colorado is different than some other states. Some other states present it as just, do you want to recall this person? And if that happens, you do another election. In Colorado, you do it all at once. So do you want to recall this person? Yes or no? If this person is recalled, who do you want to replace them with? And the list of successors. Question. See question?
So I had a quick question. What's VSPCs?
Yes, that is a voter service and polling center. So that's our nomenclature for your in-person polling place. Just as an example, and I had to kind of blow this up, so it's maybe a little bit tough to see, but I wanted to show you generally what this looks like. This is what the ballot looked like for State Senator John Morse back in 2013. This is basically what it would look like today. You can see that the ballot at the top is going to include two statements. The statement of grounds, so that's the proponents of the recall are saying, this is why this person should be recalled. Then the person being recalled gets to basically have a rebuttal on the face of the ballot saying, hey, this is why you should not vote to recall me. Below that is the question, hey, do you want to recall this person? Yes or no? And then below that is the successor candidates. In this case, there was only one and a write-in. It's interesting to note, you actually don't have to vote in the first question to vote in the second, and vice versa. You know, you don't have to vote in both.
Caleb, we have a couple of questions in the chat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me look at that here.
Kate, you want to read those out? Or a few?
I can read them out as we go
You
here.
got it?
Yeah.
So first one is from Celeste.
Oh yeah, you're right, Celeste. I forgot about Senator Hudak. Question: in Colorado, if the governor is recalled, does the lieutenant governor become governor, or does the recall process choose a successor? The recall process would actually choose a successor. The lieutenant governor, if you want to recall them, it would be a separate process in and of itself. So you could theoretically have a governor and lieutenant governor of opposing parties in that case. How does funding for a recall election work? That's a good question. Depending on how many, depending on how much money you are raising as the recall proponents and how much money you are spending to like print petitions, to do advertisements or whatever, you may have some obligations under our campaign finance regime. That is an area a little outside my expertise, so I don't want to speculate on exactly what you need to do. But what I will say is that a recall election, like any other election, does have some campaign finance obligations. And we always tell folks, if you're running a recall, you really need to call our office and ask about what you need to be filing, what you can and cannot do when it comes to campaign finance expenditures and fundraising. Who gets to choose the successor candidates? Yeah, that's interesting. The way in Colorado it works is you actually have the candidates themselves basically petition to be on the recall ballot. So theoretically, you could have, a whole bunch of Republicans, a whole bunch of Democrats running as successors for a race. Generally speaking, because the time frame is a little bit short, you usually end up with one of the opposing party, like you did here with Senator Morse. But it's not controlled by the party at all. It's fully controlled by, if you want to run as an unaffiliated, as a Republican or a Democrat for successor, you can. You just have to get enough signatures to get on the ballot. For school boards, is the number of signatures needed for all districts or for individual districts? I get this question a lot, so I got to make sure I get it right. It depends on the school district. School districts have different forms of, representation, right? So you got school director districts, at-large districts. In most school districts that I am aware of, even if you have school director districts, those school director districts are voted on by the entire county or by the entire school district. So in that case, you'd be looking at signatures from the entire district. You need to go collect, you can collect signatures from the entire district, and it would be 40% of the votes cast for that district director position in the last election. So let's say it's hypothetically BVSD, director district B, right? That you want to recall. Well, you're going to have to get 40% of the signatures or 40% of the votes cast for that director district position in the last election. And there's some exceptions there, like a lot of school boards don't actually end up having an election because people don't run for it. So they just get voted in by acclamation. If in that case, we go to a different formula that's based on the entirety of the population of the district. So it can change. School districts are a little bit unique in that way. Good questions, though. All right, so I'm going to go through a brief step-by-step so that you kind of get the idea of how this works in practice. So step one, if you want to recall somebody, you got to go get a petition format. And you get that from your county clerk, or you get it from our office, depending on the race you're talking about. You might need to form you do need to get a committee. The committee is made up of 1 to 3 people who are going to represent the recall proponents in everything. So that means campaign finance filing obligations. If your recall ends up in court, you are in charge of the recall. And that can be 1 to 3 people, basically. And then you need a reason. This can be any reason. It does not, it's interesting because the statute says it needs to be truthful, but the clerk really actually is not allowed to pontificate on the truthfulness of a statement. So basically the only limitation there is it has to be, I believe it's 200 words or less. Why do you want to recall this person? You need to have a written out reason. And it could be because, they don't like the color green. It literally could be that. In Colorado, there is no threshold for, you need to have, bad action or something like that to recall somebody. Step 2, once you've got your petition format and it's good to go, you got to circulate. And again, like we talked about, we've got 60 days. There might be some campaign finance implications. And like every other circulation in Colorado, everything's on paper, at least at the state level. I know in Boulder, they're doing some other stuff, but generally speaking, at the state level, everything's on paper. So here's an example of a petition that was pulled for Governor Polis a couple of years ago. And you can see they've filled in the general statement of grounds there. They have the name of the people who are representing the recall, so that they're the recall committee. They're on the face of the petition. And it's going to be, if you go to King Soopers and you've ever signed a initiative petition, it's going to look exactly the same as those. Now, this is a little bit outdated because there's some other stuff that the legislature now requires to be put on the face of the petition, but you get the general idea of what it's going to look like. Step 3, once you've got your signatures and you turned them in, the designated election official is going to look at those. They got 28 days to do that. And then you can't add signatures once you've turned it in, but you can cure some. So if you have a signature discrepancy, you can cure it just like you would cure a signature discrepancy on a ballot, basically. If you get past that hurdle and you've got enough signatures, then you get to challenges, and that can take over a month. You can challenge it to the county clerk or to our office, and then if that doesn't work, you go up the next level to like district court, and eventually you can go to the Supreme Court. So that takes some time usually. It's some time that people aren't typically thinking about, but it does take quite a while in many cases. Step 5, if you get through that and you're still good, then we've got to wait 5 days to see if the incumbent resigns. So you could go through all this work and be ready to go to a recall election, and the incumbent could say, you know what, forget it, it's not worth it, I'm quitting. If they resign at that point, it's all done. We're not going to have a recall election. We're not going to move forward. It's over. Assuming the incumbent says, no, I want to fight it out, then at that point, you finally set a date. It's a little bit weird because you got to set a date for holding the election, which is 30 to 60 days out from that point in time. Now, the date for holding the election is 22 days before election day. It's the date that we mail ballots out. It's a very wonky way of doing it, but basically the Constitution has some weird language in there that required them to do it this way when they set it up under our current mail ballot model. And you might end up actually holding that with another election. It's actually relatively likely that that will be held with like a coordinated or a primary or a general election. Finally, you get to that point, we get to election day, you need a majority of voters to cast in favor of removing them to get that person out. And then the successor with the most votes takes the job. And like I said, you can vote on either or once you get there. So that's the general process. That's the gist. Now, of course, there are a lot of details in there that I didn't cover. And we talk that out with any recall proponents who come to us or opponents who come to us. And we're happy to spell that out for them, as are the county clerks at the more local level. So there are some recent changes that the legislature made to this process, most notably in SB 21-250. Some of the bigger changes that I'll talk quickly about are the cost estimate and incumbent statement. So you saw that petition format that I showed a little bit earlier. Now, instead of just that top section that just shows the statement of grounds, you're going to have the statement of grounds. Below that, you're going to have something that says, hey, if we go to a recall election, the county clerk estimates that it will cost the county X amount of dollars. The county clerk basically has to say, okay, I think it's going to cost us so much money. And it's the political subdivision that incumbent is in that's paying that bill. It's not the incumbent. It's the so if for example, I know BVSD has a recall going right now, right? So if they go to an election and that actually happens, BVSD foots that bill, not the incumbent. And then there's also an incumbent statement. So you saw that on the ballot earlier. That's always been the case. The incumbent gets to say why you shouldn't recall them. Now the incumbent also gets to say it on the petition. They get to say, this is why you shouldn't sign this petition, basically. I'm a good person, or I've done my job right, or whatever they want to say. They get to do what they want there. It's like a limit of 300 words. So those are some pretty massive changes to kind of inform the public a little bit more when they're signing these things. There's some.
Can I
Oh,
jump
yeah.
in a second? Shelby, did you get your question answered that was in the chat?
Yes, I asked it too soon. It's answered. Thank you.
Oh,
Okay.
perfect. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep, they pay for it. There's actually an interesting thing in the recall statute too, that if the incumbent, if it actually gets to an election and the incumbent wins, so they're not recalled, if we get that far, then not only does the political subdivision get to pay for the recall election, they also get to reimburse the incumbent for all the expenses that they had in like basically campaigning to stay on the ballot. So that's kind of a weird quirk, but it protects incumbents basically in the event that they win. Now, if they lose, they're out all their money. But so it can end up being relatively costly for the governmental body that incumbent's in. There's some petition review changes that they made. So when the DEO is looking at a petition, they're now checking signatures. That was not true before. We were just checking information. Now they actually compare signatures just like they do on your ballot. A mailing address now works. That has been true for initiative petitions for some time, but it's also true now for recall elections. There's some additional changes to county level recalls because county level recalls aren't as prescriptive in the Constitution. So for example, you can only sign a recall petition at the county level or lower now if you are active, no ID required. And that basically you could be an inactive voter because like you had mail bounce from your house or whatever. If you're an inactive voter right now, you cannot sign a county level or lower recall petition. It wouldn't count. So that's actually a pretty significant change. The other changes are removing names. So before, you could always pull your name off of a recall petition. You would call up your DEO and say, hey, I signed this and I didn't want to, or I changed my mind or whatever. You could call them up and say, please take my name off that. But that ended like 5 days after the petition was turned in. Now you can do that all the way through the time that they set a date for the election. So it basically gives incumbents another avenue to try to whittle down that list. If it comes in initially sufficient, they can go out there and try to get folks to pull their names off. If they can convince them that they don't, shouldn't be signing that. And then combining elections now is much more likely. In the past, you had to be only like 60 days out from an election to combine it with another. Now for county level recalls, it's 120 days out. You combine it with the next election. So and that's kind of a cost saving thing. When counties can run it all, with an election they had to run anyway, then all you're really talking about as an added expense is a little more space on a page instead of having to run an entire election. So some final thoughts here. So some of the big picture is that the Constitution in Colorado has a right reserved to the people on par with the initiative and referendum when it comes to recall. It is a fundamental right of the citizens of the state. However, it is very difficult to achieve, particularly statewide. I have gone and looked. I have never seen a case in the state of Colorado's history where a statewide officer even got to an election, much less was actually recalled, because it's so time limited and you need so many signatures. I mean, you've really got to have an organized, well-funded effort that's ready to shoot out the gates. I mean, we're literally talking about, I think we estimated at one time, it's something like 30 to 40,000 signatures, or 20 to 30,000 signatures a day. That is very difficult to achieve. I would say almost impossible, frankly. And then it's easy to pull a petition format, but it's not easy to make it to the finish line. We get people asking about and pulling petition formats all the time when it comes to recall. And that's state level down. It happens almost everywhere. I would say that the amount of those recall petitions that actually get to an election is probably less than 15%. I mean, it's really low. It's just hard to do. It's hard to get enough signatures. It's hard to get those validated. It's a really challenging thing. So you've got to really have an organized community effort to get that incumbent out. So that's my presentation on recall. And I'm happy to answer any questions y'all might have.
Caleb, if you want to stop sharing, then we can see the bigger screen, and then we'll see if
Yeah.
anybody has any additional questions. Either raise your hand, someone.
See Celeste?
Yeah, Celeste, why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hi. So in Broomfield, there was a recall election for Greg Stokes, and he had, what, 2 or 3 months left on his term, and he was not running for reelection. I don't know if he could or not. But I think that might be different because it was a city county of Broomfield and doesn't go by the same rules as regular counties. Okay.
Yeah, Broomfield's a city and
Okay.
county, so they get to do whatever they want. Basically, it would be in their charter.
Okay.
It is kind of weird, though. I mean, you kind of think about it, it's like, well, that was pointless, but you know.
And it did not succeed either.
Right.
So, okay, thanks.
I see a question. Are there any restrictions on who can be listed as a possible successor? If someone lost the election, can they? Oh, that's a great question. The incumbent cannot be listed as a successor. So you can't say, keep me, but also vote for me as a successor. So no, you're stuck there. And then otherwise, the only restriction is that you have to qualify for the office that you're running to succeed. So you've got to be 18. You've got to be a registered voter in the state. Depending on actually the General Assembly office, you may need to be a little bit older, for example. And then for like school district offices in particular, usually school districts require that you live within the director district that you're running for. So if you wanted to be a successor for that director district, you would need to live in that district. Good question.
Hope you want to go ahead and unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Thanks, Caleb. That was a really great talk. I was wondering, you did not cover city elections, but I was wondering if there's a way, like, what are the resources to find out about city elections? How, like, you know, is there, I just don't know anything about that.
Really, the problem with city recalls is it really truly does vary city to city, because a lot of cities in the state are home rule. And when you're home rule, it's kind of anything goes. So it really depends. Like if you're really interested in a particular city, you pretty much got to go to the city clerk and ask them about it. They're going to be the ones who would know. There is a statutory regime for statutory towns. So if you're in a smaller town that doesn't have their own home rule charter, you know, they would have to follow a very specific process. We don't oversee that in our office, but you would talk to, probably in that case, you're going to go talk to the city clerk again. Now, I will say this, city level recalls are relatively rare, although they're becoming more common. And so if you talk to the clerk, they may not know a whole lot about it because they haven't seen it in 100 years or whatever in their little town. So, but it does happen, especially in little mountain towns lately. It's been a big thing in little mountain towns. Like, I don't know what it is. Like people get really amped up about ATVs in particular. Like they either love them or they hate them. So anyway, see a lot of recalls that are like really focused on ATVs, which I find fascinating.
Jack, why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself and you can ask your question. And if you're, Jack, you have your hand up if you want to unmute yourself. Well, while Jack's unmuting, I'm going to ask my question. So Caleb, do you do tracking of recalls and statistics? I mean, is it, have you seen a recent rise in the last, I don't know how many years, with recalls in the state?
The only thing we really track would be recalls that we would be kind of in charge of, I guess you would say. So those offices that we certify to the ballot, district attorney, general assembly, and state level. What I will say is that, you know, counties talk to us all the time about their recalls and what's going on with them. And absolutely, there has been an uptick, a pretty significant one, I would say, since about 2019, especially at the school board level. That one is the one that's really exploded, I would say. We've seen interest, at least, in school district recalls all over the state. It is not just focused on the Front Range. We've seen it. I've seen it in the southwest corner. I've seen it out on the Eastern Plain. I've seen it on the Front Range. So I would say absolutely there's been an increased interest. Now, have there been a significant uptick in school district candidates, losing in a recall race? No. We have one right now in Windsor RE4, I think, out in Weld County. And they've turned in their signatures. They're a little further along than most get. And one of the incumbents, I believe, just resigned. So it is happening a lot more, I would say. I don't have the stats to show that, but I definitely from a.
Great. And Jack, why don't you go ahead and ask your question? Or we can read it from your chat or from the chat. So Jack's question, I think, is, has there been any serious attempt to remove recall from the Constitution?
No, not that I have seen. Now, I'm not sure going back in the annals of history, if you would have seen that. Generally speaking, to get something out of the Constitution, you got to go to a vote of the people. And the people generally don't like having a right that they have reserved for them taken away. So I would think that that's very unlikely, even if you were to somehow muster up the 2/3 that you need in the General Assembly in both chambers to get it on the ballot. I think it'd be very unlikely to pass.
Are there any other questions for Caleb? Okay, if not, just wanted to thank you. You can certainly stick around. We've got a couple other presentations, but we thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I love it. I love talking about it. And again, if you have any questions about it, feel free to call us. Feel free to call your county clerk, your city clerk, and always happy to chat about it.
Great. I'm going to stop recording now, and then